Hello.
Our story begins with a rational decision. Perhaps the most sane composed thought since their return to Coruscant following Order 66. Bail Organa interfered with Yoda's decision-making. Not to question the 900-year-old Master Jedi, who managed to lose an entire Jedi Order to a single Sith Lord in a burnt pretzel, but sending Luke Skywalker to the Lars homestead on Tatooine wasn't just foolish, it was vacuous. He exclaimed that if he were the Emperor, and his star student had just been killed, that would be the first place he went. Anyone connected to the family. Even if Padmé was proclaimed dead, and even if they were holding a ceremonious funeral for her, it didn't matter. They were going to kill that poor family and send Luke off to become the apprentice Anakin could have been. Bail told the two Jedi that he wouldn't stand for it. He'd take both twins, but even that was too far. If Sidious found one, then they'd both be taken. Adopting two children would be suspicious, even without connection to anything the Sith Lord could possibly see. Obi-Wan searched Yoda's face for a reaction, before asking Bail where they should send the boy. He shrugged his shoulders. Anywhere. Anywhere that wasn't directly connected to the mother or father. The Nabiris and the Lars were not a safe place to send the children. Choose any one of the senators in the entire galaxy that cared for Padmé. At least have the conscious heart to give that boy a chance in life. Leia would be a princess of Alderaan. She'd have a chance for a normal adolescence. On Tatooine, those same freedoms might not be awarded. The Sith were one consideration of a threat, but even further, what about the Hutts, the pirates, the Tuskens who killed the boy's grandmother? It was a foolish decision, and the Jedi knew it was. Yoda turned around and frowned, seeing yet another one of his errors play out in front of them. Bail then came to the conclusion before Yoda could say anything else, and he suggested that perhaps Mon Mothma of Chandrila would be willing to take the boy in. He might not grow up in royalty, but he would at least have a chance to exist in isolation from the Emperor's grips, or the fraudulence of the Hutts. Kenobi realized that without watching over the boy, he had no purpose, and started to reconsider where he might fit in all of this. But maybe, more than anything, this offered Obi-Wan a chance to make a decision for himself. If Mon agreed to bringing Luke into her family, then he could become an aide to surviving Jedi. There had to be at the very least a couple dozen individuals who got the message before it was too late and escaped into the galaxy. It'd be a better option than using Luke as an excuse to lay low. In the following minutes, after some discussion, Mothma heartily responded that she would take the boy. This, more than anything, was out of a heartbreak for the loss of her friend Padmé. She wasn't concerned with the politics of having a Force-sensitive child, because that wasn't something she was even aware of at the moment. Bail would of course give her some information about the parents of Luke, and what that might mean for her and her husband Perrin, but that would come later. For now, the four would agree to splitting the twins up at Alderaan and Chandrila. Yoda would go into hiding on Dagobah, and Obi-Wan was not invited to join either senator on their home worlds. This wasn't out of disrespect or distrust, but because it wasn't safe for anyone. Obi-Wan could follow Yoda to the swamp, or he could find his own path. He would eventually, before the funeral service for Padmé, make a choice to go the latter route. His endeavors would immediately take him across the galaxy, using General Grievous's starship as a temporary home and his main transportation device. Mon was now a part of the Jedi Rebellion, something she had initially no interest in joining. The service for the former Queen of Naboo was nothing short of heartbreaking. Mothma struggled to hold herself together throughout it. She and Padmé had a real relationship. Initially, Mon didn't trust the 18-year-old senator when she first joined the Senate, but Padmé grew on her, and eventually they became close friends, almost inseparable colleagues inside the Senate chambers. There was only one other senator close to her that was still alive, that being Bail. The other one would have been Anaconda Far. The poor Rodian man would have loved these twins, but now they were being ripped away from each other. Their fates, their futures, their destinies, unknown at this current moment. Bail and Breya were much more happy to have Leia in their hands than Perrin and Mon were. Due to the situation surrounding their current marriage, it was a little hard for Mon to bring Luke back home without some sort of excuse. She suggested that it was out of Perrin's hope to have a son someday, and he went with that excuse without thinking much of it. Their marriage was a bit strenuous because they were forced into their vows from a young age. in an arranged ceremony. Mon had no control over it, and she was a product of her societal duty to her family. She may have had other considerations, but she joined the Senate a year following their marriage, so she never got around to actually abandoning the relationship. Luke was a quiet child, an infant that didn't demand a whole lot of attention, which was especially helpful given the situation. Mon was attempting to block Imperial legislation in whichever way she could without putting a target on her back. Perrin was doing Perrin things, and this left Skywalker to the care of the various nannies, maids, and housekeepers around the Senator's home on Chandrila. Mon felt bad about this, and she didn't want Luke to feel as if he was being forgotten or abandoned. The galaxy had just shifted drastically, and truthfully, she never intended on having a child with Perrin, up until a couple months after Luke's adoption, and she found out she was pregnant. It added even more tension to their relationship, but they continued to persevere, despite the challenges brought to them by the surprise pregnancy and the adopted child. There was also a problem Mothma faced immediately upon bringing Luke home. She forced herself not to love him. Naturally, that was almost impossible, but she trained herself to push down any sort of attachment to Luke in the first few months she had him. When she became pregnant, it became even more agonizing to do this. Mon wasn't being selfish by refusing to love Luke. She didn't treat him badly or neglect him in the slightest. When she was home on Chandrila, she spent most of her time with him. But she refused to fall in love with her adopted son because of the chances that he could be taken away from her. That was an unimaginable fear. With what would become their daughter on the way, she couldn't possibly fathom the depths of the agony she would endure if she truly loved this boy and watched the Emperor strip him away from their family. It was painful just to think about, but she tried to stop herself for as long as she could. Eventually, she gave in. By the time she had her daughter, Lydia, she adored her son Luke. He was not adopted. He, like her daughter, was as much a Mothma as she was. Mon now was able to use the presence of her quote-unquote second child to remove any chances of questioning or intrigue from the outside. The birth of Lydia elicited her the ability to feel more comfortable bringing Luke with her to Coruscant, which of course meant his younger sister would join them too. One person, though, who helped her through all of this was her beloved cousin, Vel Sartha. She was always a more royal girl, despite being born into a family where she could inherit millions of credits. Vel and Mon were always close. They always cared for each other, but they were two vastly different people. When Luke was first brought home, she was the first person Mon called. The same went for when she found out about Lydia. It was Vel who helped Mon release the barriers she put around herself. It was also Vel who helped Mon allow herself to love her son. Outside of the family practices of the Mothmas on Chandrila and inside the senatorial districts of Coruscant was Obi-Wan Kenobi. His life was a little different than Luke's or Leia's. In the years since Luke got his younger sister, he had found himself allies across the stars. The first Jedi Kenobi found was young Caleb Doom, and he started to instruct the boy. For both Jedi, it was exactly what they needed. Caleb needed guidance, and Obi-Wan needed someone to care for. Under the secretive names of Ben Kenobi and Kanan Jarrus, the journey of master and apprentice began again. Along with their adventures was the first interaction with Quinlan Vos. He was one of the few surviving Jedi Masters of the Order, and instead of going into hiding, Master Vos went into the galaxy to make a difference. At the moment, the path was nothing short of a hope, but it was more than hiding in a swamp, waiting for the future to come. It was doing something that benefited people. The camaraderie between Quinlan and Obi-Wan was recaptured when they reunited, and it was picked up by Doom, who aspired to be like the Jedi that took care of him. He loved being with Kenobi and Vos. They were like home. Obi-Wan, being a former counselor, helped a lot with this, because Ben told the young Jedi stories of Depa Billaba. She was one of the youngest counselors ever brought to the High Council, trained by one of the great Jedi of their era. Caleb belonged to a very special lineage, the Vapad lineage, and he should never forget that. Obi-Wan certainly never let the boy live that down, and it helped Kanan become a more rounded Bogan Jedi. No longer were the rules of the old order taught. These were survival instincts, lessons that would give him the choice to choose between life and death. Caleb and Obi-Wan would continue into the galaxy together, as Quinlan did, bringing new survivors into the path and get them to safe houses anywhere they could be found. The underground network was just at its inception, but General Kenobi was an extra motivational boost needed to give the path its legs. Quillen was only one man. Ben doubled their chances of making a difference before Vader ever got to or found the survivors. On Chandrila, in the years after Luke came home and Leia were born, the Mothmas prospered beautifully. In a similar respect to Princess Organa of Alderaan, the brother and sister of Chandrila would be raised in elegance, tradition, and academic brilliance. The Mothmas, despite their marital disagreements, were highly educated individuals. They were able to thrive off of being intelligent, and this was passed down to their children. Perrin had become more accepting of Skywalker since his daughter was born, mostly because he actually had a child to call his own. As what they now called the twins, grew up, Perrin stopped rejecting Luke more. It wasn't an aggressive thing, more standoffish. Luke growing up just thought his father was like that, but as he got older he realized, to a degree, that it was a choice by Perrin. Thanks to not growing up in the deserts of Tatooine, Luke was free to adventure more frequently. There was a reason he and his sister were called the twins. They were very similar. They were also inseparable. It led to Mon suggesting that Leia and Luke know the truth about themselves, but Bail continued to shut it down, so much so that he proactively made sure Leia and Luke never met at official functions. It created some strain in his own relationship with Leia, but he believed it was for the better. Luke and Leia were what Luke and Leia could have been, what they should have been had their father not betrayed himself and ruined the future of the galaxy. Thanks in part to their varying lavish lifestyles, Luke and Leia were able to access the Force in varying degrees. Leia, for example, knew that Bail was hiding something, and she was also well aware that she was adopted before ever officially being told about it. Luke, on the other hand, was more outward with his use of the Force. Leia was gifted inwardly, but would have been able to utilize those same gifts as Luke if someone like Ben trained her. Luke, though, with his sister, always used the Force as a toy. He was told very assertively from his mother to not show his gifts off to anyone else. He and Leia listened attentively, but they always used the Force when they played in the vast gardens of their home. Tag was a big-time game for them. Sometimes throwing things off the cliff was another game. Luke's ability to use the Force helped them get cookies from the top shelf, or a ball they lost in a tree. Ironically, playing with his sister gave him a chance to train with the Force that Leia never had, because she had terrible cousins and no brother. The studying for the twins on Chandrila, Leia and Luke, was tedious, but they were both very intelligent thanks to their upbringing. They were study buddies, and as a result constantly challenged each other for the top spot in their classes. It would be here, in the late years of his middle school instruction, that Luke started to find intrigue in the political theater, especially of Republic history. The boy was a history obsessor, his sister not so much, but because she succeeded in their government classes and he in their history, they traded their work and progressively got more intelligent in both of their respective fields. Leia on Alderaan, without her brother, sadly didn't have the same experience, but she was a very intelligent student. Thanks to her own upbringing, she was able to thrive in academies, while also becoming very politically active from a young age. Mon actually tried to discourage her children from pursuing such paths. Leia listened, until her brother decided to go against her mother's recommendations. After Luke started his pursuit of politics, and the potential future of representative or senator of Chandrila, Leia fell right in line. Along with the many things siblings did, this was a good way for them to push each other. It was young Luke who gave Leia the idea to continue down this path, because she had done so well in school. Meanwhile, the relationship shared between the so-called twins and their parents continued to blossom. In a weird way, it brought Perrin and Mon closer. They still had fundamental differences, ones that would never fix their marital problems, but they were able to enjoy being around each other, as long as they were in the company of their adored children. Luke and Leia always proposed family outings, whether these were movie nights, picnics, tent sleepovers in the garden, or just regular vacations. It brought everyone in the family unit closer together. This was a wealthy family, and the twins encouraged that they at the very least self-indulge a little. But even at that, Mon could never sit still, and this attribute, while belonging to his biological mother, is something Luke also adopted from his current adopted mother. Out in the galaxy, Kenobi continued to blossom with the path under his fingertips. He had saved a number of future would-be Inquisitors. Among them were Reva. She was a frustrated young girl when Ben found her, but it was through the same camaraderie that Caleb learned from Quinlan and Obi-Wan that brought her back to the light, in a way. She struggled a lot with the pulls of the dark side, and it was that very pull towards darkness that saved her life. But as Ben instructed, it was time to grow beyond that pain. The Boken Jedi of the now were less focused on their moral code from the old order, and instead developed more free expressions of self and of the Force. Ben Kenobi had brought in members like Reva, Baylan Skoll, Seer, Cal Kestis, Barriss Offee, and Sha Kun. It was Obi-Wan who saved Sha from attempting to fight Vader. While neither of them knew that she was preparing to fight the Dark Lord of the Sith, it was his word that kept her from returning to the core to fight what they thought would have been the Emperor. Vader didn't appear on Obi-Wan's radar for a couple years, in all honesty. His former apprentice was searching the galaxy for the Jedi, but in a weird and even sick way, Obi-Wan had moved on. He was forced to due to the care he had for Caleb Dume. He couldn't be sad and depressed while instructing another student. Ben had a purpose, and instead of sulking in a cave on Tatooine, he was moving constantly. He was training with determination, and was a constant inspiration to those he saved. Obi-Wan's involvement bolstered the path into what Quinlan always believed it could be, but earlier. In getting the foundational operation of the path started sooner, after having saved more Jedi than would have been protected without Ben's involvement, there were more citizens, Force users, and Jedi that avoided certain death. This of course ensured that the burden was even heavier, because failure meant more people would perish, but it was a worthwhile cause. When Kenobi learned about Anakin's survival, about 5 years following the events on Mustafar, he relapsed hard. If it wasn't for his now adult student, and Ahsoka by his side, he wouldn't have recovered. Obi-Wan was working through Mapuzo when news reached about another Darth Vader campaign. Again, Obi-Wan's main focus was saving people, not keeping up with Imperial warlords. It was just that name, Vader, that caught his attention, and he learned the truth because of it. But it was something they avoided, something Ahsoka and Kanan pushed Ben to stay away from. There was a very real possibility of running into Vader. He and the very tiny Inquisitorius unit had been viciously hunting the path, to no avail. Ben, therefore, issued out a request to every safe house to avoid interaction with Vader. If he showed up, burn the site and move to a new location. If he followed them, then Obi-Wan would handle it. The time for Kenobi and Vader to cross paths, again, didn't come until 7 years after that, when Luke and Leia were both 12 years old. Ben Kenobi was not rehabilitating his skills or remembering how to use the Force when they met. Vader obviously believed he was a superior duelist, even though he hadn't fought many Jedi since gaining the suit. He had at least led successful conquests. His aspirations for revenge would never see completion. It would be Kenobi who defeated Darth Vader in a singular engagement, and he would kill him before ever revealing the mask. Ben would not have done this traditionally, but they crossed each other at a hidden path location, one where dozens of children were ferried away from Imperial hands a week. And after Obi-Wan saw what Anakin did inside the temple, he wouldn't let Vader do it again. This was the future of the path, the future of the galaxy. These children needed to be protected. Whatever Palpatine wanted with these kids was unknown, but they would never find themselves in his hands. Ben Kenobi, as Reva and Cal Kestis, ferried survivors of the path away from the stormtroopers who chased them, watched as Vader was demolished. The two Inquisitors who came to aid their master chased after the two Jedi present. Kestis and Reva would be unstoppable as a duo. Much like Kanan and Jarrus, they had been trained exceptionally by Ben Kenobi, and they were able to easily overpower the untrained Inquisitor unit. The path location, after Obi-Wan killed Darth, would be burned, and the few stormtroopers who tried to arrest Kenobi would perish. It'd be a tough day for Ben, but he took it as one that needed to happen. In the flames of a path hideout, Vader's body would be consumed by the Force. Never given the chance to return from the dark, never seeing his children, and never being embraced by Qui-Gon's gift, of immortality. The Sith had killed billions. Vader had slaughtered most of them with his bare hands. This action, as Obi-Wan's students and friends reminded him, had liberated their souls. The families of those who were slaughtered by Vader and people that feared him could rest, knowing that the monster had been destroyed. Ahsoka and Ben had the hardest time with this defeat, but they also understood and accepted how necessary it was. They chose to remember Anakin for who he was when they last saw him, not for the masked man Kenobi defeated. This defeat almost pushed Obi-Wan away from his duty to the path, but Ahsoka and Kanan would help him remain sturdy, and he would return to guiding those who were lost. Sidious, as a result, was very upset, logically. He couldn't believe it. Vader had trained so hard and got so far, but in the end it didn't matter. He prepared so much for this encounter, and Palpatine seemingly underestimated the knowledge Obi-Wan had over his former student. Thanks to this defeat, Palpatine brought in his new heir to the Empire. Mara Jade was already secretly in tutelage. Grand Inquisitor and a surviving pack of marauders were being sent out into the galaxy to fetch him a new apprentice. Their duty was simple: find someone of exceptional talent and bring them home. This, of course, was a backhanded request from the Emperor. He had just told all the Inquisitors that they were temporary, but they listened. In the coming months, the entire Inquisitorius, the Acolytes of the Beyond, and the Knights of Ren would gang up to defeat Emperor Palpatine. They would attack him inside the Imperial Palace. The Sith Lord, even without training or using his saber since defeating Master Yoda, slaughtered the foolish Force adepts. They assumed that numbers would be too daunting for the Emperor, but with Mara watching, he showed her what true power was. Vader was weak. This alliance was weaker. In the span of 10 or so minutes, every single one of the 43 Force adepts who came to assassinate him lay lifelessly on the grounds of the Imperial Palace. Only one lightsaber was needed by Palpatine, one weapon and a mastery of the Force. These were integral lessons for his new apprentice, the individual he called the future Empress, something he never intended for Mara to ever have. On Leia's 16th birthday, Luke bought her an ancient relic from a shop owner that was good friends with his mother. Luthen provided the now 17-year-old junior representative something handpicked for his sister. Of course, this purchase came on Mon's credit card, but she hoped that Leia would like it, which she didn't. It was a piece of High Republic history. To Luke, it signified the bond of their sibling relationship, an antique from governmental history. It was a golden cross-like ornament that used to hang inside the office of Chancellor Lina So. The 200-year-plus-old Chancellor was an inspiration to Leia. Lina So was the only individual that Leia connected with in Republic history, and she was the main purpose of inspiration behind Leia's pursuit of politics at the moment. Though with a potential arranged marriage coming up, that might put a damper on her own political aspirations. Even though that created a small divide within the household, it did not fracture the relationship between siblings. Leia and Luke loved each other, and nothing their parents did would disrupt their kinship and friendship. This gift from Luke and Mon was a hope to signify that. Leia knew her mother had a hand in it, but she only thanked her brother. While his sister attached herself to Perrin, Luke became Mon's shadow. In a similar way to Leia and Bail, Luke learned on the day-to-day from his mother, but the days were counting down until she would be forced to leave the Imperial Senate. There, however, was a benefit to Mon Mothma serving as Luke's mother. She had come to the conclusion that Luke needed to be trained in the Force. This was a secret kept from Perrin. He was not to know, but Luke's lovely aunt, as they called her, Vel, took Luke on expeditions around the galaxy. She and Luthen weren't very involved with the hidden path, nor did they interact with Jedi a whole lot, but Vel had connections, as did Mon, but it was safer for them to contact these individuals through Vel, because she wasn't a senator. Among the individuals Luke trained with and under were Kanan Jarrus, Sha Kun, and Baylan Skoll. It was a mixed bag of instructors. Luke's favorite by far was Kanan Jarrus. They got along really well, but Kanan, even though he was a part of Ben Kenobi's entourage, still found himself with Hera Syndulla. So Kanan was very integral to the Lothal theater of rebel activity. When Luke turned 15, he saw less and less of his friend Kanan. Sha Kun was a great instructor. She was the niece of legendary Counselor Plo Koon. Luke enjoyed her a lot. She was very talented with a saber, like Plo was. She was like the combination of saber skill from Balin and ingenuity, kindness, and understanding from Kanan. Luke wasn't the biggest fan of Skull, but Balin pushed Luke harder than anyone else did, so it all worked out in one way or another. Ben Kenobi would have trained Luke himself, but his importance to the path could not be overstated. Ben could not situate himself on a planet to train Luke in the wilderness. He was constantly moving, constantly setting up safe houses and so forth. The reason Luke couldn't accompany Ben, like Reva, Cal, Kanan, or anyone else could, was due to being a senator's son. Palpatine had been hunting for a new student, and the path knew that, so keeping Luke as far away from danger was necessary. It was entirely due to this position that Luke never got a chance to fully meet his biological sister or Ben Kenobi. He was fully a junior representative, and worked tenaciously to succeed in that field, but he was also very committed to his Boken Jedi studies. It wasn't planned, but it happened to work out that when Luke turned 12, the same year his biological father died, he was introduced to Jedi instruction by Mon Mothma. While Skywalker and Perrin were still good with each other, Luke didn't like keeping secrets from his father. In a funny way, as a result of all of this, Perrin pushed Luke to go into athletics because, due to his forced training, Luke was a genuine athletic monster. But Skywalker believed he had an unfair advantage and didn't want to do that to kids participating without fully having the usage of the Force that he had. The excuse Luke gave was something Perrin commended, but it also drove a slight wedge between them as a result because Perrin didn't know the full truth. Regardless, Luke was working in a manner similar to his mother. This brought them extremely close to each other. He aspired to be like Mon in so many ways, but he also understood the importance of his training, or at least he thought he did. Luke knew pieces of information about his parents. He did not know about Vader's demise, only that Anakin had been killed at the end of the Clone War. It was to alleviate pressure, which worked, but Mon didn't try and protect Luke from the truth like Bail did with Leia. And despite their real siblings not knowing the truth about each other and barely having ever interacted, it didn't impact Luke's relationship with his mother, because she was at least communicative about Luke's biological parents. He idolized her in many ways that he would have idolized his own birth mother. But then came the shift. I'm gonna break the fourth wall for a second here, so I'm sorry, but mild spoilers for Andor Season 2, Episode 9. The shift for everything started the day Mon Mothma spoke out against the Gorman genocide. At this point, Mon had warned Luke to remain far from the Senate, and from Coruscant. He listened, until, like a teenager, he thought he knew better. Young Skywalker knew that the Imperial propagandized incident at Gore was a massacre, one that the media was covering up to favor Imperial patriotism. At the point Mon was going to make a speech, she was informed by Luthen that Bail Organa's camp had been infiltrated by Imperials who planned to arrest her upon her escape. Luthen sent in 2 individuals, both of which knew the other was there, Cassian Andor and Luke Mothma. It had been assumed up until this point that Erskine Samaj had been compromised by the ISB and was working on their behalf. Luke, in an effort to save and protect his mother, dressed up in an all-black uniform, as a means to represent the death the Empire brought to Gore. It was the darkest outfit inside the entire Senate building, but he wore it anyways, and due to his slim build, he broke in through the ventilation shafts, because he needed his lightsaber. Andor, on the other hand, used the loading docks. Following Mothma's harrowing speech before the complacent Imperial Senate, she was greeted by Cassian outside the Senate pod. He promised to escort her. Luke was a little behind due to the whole ventilation situation. By the time they got down to the main corridors, they were confronted by an ISB agent, and Cassian shot her. And just before they made their escape, a red-headed young woman, not much younger than Luke, ignited a crimson lightsaber. Andor was a little out of his league here, but he fired at the individual anyways because he could. She blocked the strikes, and just as she swung in to kill Cassian and capture Mothma, she was thrown from her feet by the Force. Luke looked at Andor and then to his mother, telling them that he'd follow them out of here. Andor nodded and pushed Mon past her son, as he defended a few strikes that came his way from his opponent. This pursuit would challenge Skywalker immensely. All of his skills and talents had been honed for this moment. Both combatants were in their teens, and this was their chance to respectively prove themselves. Mara needed the Emperor's approval, and Luke wanted to save his mother, and show her that he could be a part of this resistance. Lightsabers cracked away. It forced Andor to look especially hard for an escape route for the Senator. She was integral to the Alliance, and he would do anything to get her out. That was his job. Luke's aid was needed, but also a slight distraction because it audibly told Imperials where the Senator was. Didn't matter for Cassian because he was talented enough as a shooter, and stormtroopers weren't much of a match for him. Though the stormtroopers were few and far between, so not really a total challenge. Luke and Mara behind them were doing a pursuit drill. Skywalker was backpedaling with precise footwork, and Mara was utilizing all of her master's vicious attack strategies. Neither were breaking the other. Luke wasn't necessarily trying to break her, but he'd like to get back to Andor and his mother. As Mara pressed Skywalker, he stopped, giving Mon and Cassian a chance to escape outside the facility, using the Senate Plaza to get to their escape vessel. Mothma told her escort that they could not leave her son, and while Andor wanted to sympathize with her, he had a job to do, and she had a rebellion to lead. He'd give Luke 30 seconds to get within eyesight. As they were trekking across the plaza, Mon's ISB loyal driver would be shot, and people would react, especially Mon, but not as loud as they would when Luke was flung across the plaza and landed at Andor's heels. He again spun around, pushing Mothma behind him and started firing into the direction of the vibrant redhead. She leapt through the air and swung down. As she got close to the ground, Luke pulled her towards him. This gave up her grip on the attack and she slammed into the plaza floor. Luke kicked her in the side as she tried to get up. Skywalker spun his emerald saber around his back and attacked her, telling his mother and Andor to run. He'd be right behind them. Mara's crimson saber connected and pushed back, but Luke expected this. His opponent rose to her feet and Skywalker defended the strikes she threw, before slipping under her assault and elbowing her in the back. Jade whipped her saber around towards Luke's head, but in a fashion similar to his father, he slipped his blade down towards her fingers and she released the weapon, allowing Luke to catch it. He spun the crimson and emerald sabers around into an X and placed both blades against her neck. This was power, control, strength, passion, and everything he was taught to reject. Luke had claimed victory over Sidious's second Imperial apprentice, and instead of having the voice Anakin had to kill Tyrannus, Luke just shook his head and pulled both sabers back and ran towards his mother and Andor. Mara was left in surprise and in defeat. Imperial stormtroopers appeared at the other edge of the plaza. They wouldn't catch the escapees, but Jade wouldn't escape the punishment she'd face in the coming hours. Sidious would electrocute her for failing. He would eviscerate her verbally for not completing the mission he demanded that she succeed in. An untrained Boken Jedi defeated her. What was he supposed to do with her submission of the blade? She had no weapon, no talent, and certainly no future with the Sith. Sidious all but cast her off, but did not allow her to leave the palace. She'd have to prove herself once more. While Erskine Samaj brought Mon Mothma to Gold Squadron so she could escape to Yavin, Luke was returned safely to Chandrila. Surprisingly, due to his status as a junior representative, he wasn't viewed as a Jedi insurgent. The footage of the fight, due to the clashing of sabers on a bright day, blurred what he looked like. Sidious, anyways, was more concerned with how Governor Price managed to lose 2 Star Destroyers in the Arshion Nebula while chasing Senator Mothma in a shuttle. He was perturbed with failure across the board. Another escaping Jedi was the least of his current concerns. Mon Mothma could thread the needle between the rebel cells and sew together an alliance. That was cause for concern, not a child who beat his own warrior. This, though, despite being initially good for Luke, was cause for trouble. Perrin had been planning it for weeks, but he sprung an arranged marriage on his son. Luke attempted to reject it, but Perrin didn't want to lose Luke to the rebellious habits of his wife. She was a bad influence on him, and Perrin went through extreme efforts to quote-unquote protect his son. Perrin called it protection. In reality, it was control over him. He couldn't control Mon, so they feuded. He couldn't control Luke, so he forced his hand. This arranged marriage couldn't be stopped, and that was final. However, across the core, the young girl Luke spared just came to a conclusion. After her embarrassment and the vitriol she faced from her master, she decided to escape the Sith. She wasn't conforming to the way of the light, but she couldn't help but think of how close to death she came at Luke's hands. Mara Jade faced extremities under Palpatine's instruction. He warned her of the naturally aggressive state the Jedi existed in perpetually, but when she lost, a Jedi did not torture her or hurt her. a Jedi did not harm her beyond their duel. It was a Jedi, not her master, that spared her. Mara Jade internalized that, and while Luke was meeting his future spouse for the first time, a girl that was a year younger than him, the person he had just saved made a move that would change the galaxy. Sidious certainly didn't sleep, like his master used to at least, but he did love to eat good food. Mara Jade went through extreme lengths to poison one of his meals. Because Sidious was the Dark Lord of the Sith, he wouldn't just die from food poisoning, but it gave her an avenue to use all of her anger against him. More or less, this was the long-form version of Plagueis the Wise. Instead of being killed in a drunken stupor, a dozen or so doses of poison would course through Palpatine's veins, and she would use a Royal Guardsman's pike to kill him. She then, of course, would steal one of his beautiful sabers and vanish into the Coruscant underworld. The following few months would be a whirlwind around the galaxy. Emperor Palpatine's death was a huge shock, and many people unfairly blamed the Jedi for it. Luke had just set the Jedi back probably centuries in his act on defending his mother. The people just blamed the Jedi because Palpatine died and the Old Order was visible for the first time in years. Though Palpatine's death, coming prior to the completion of Thrawn's occupation of Lothal, was galaxy-altering. The grudge match between the TIE Defender and Stardust finally came to a head. Without the Emperor to mediate his favoritism, Thrawn became more vocal about the need for stronger starfighters. Thanks to a non-blinded Kanan Jarrus and Ezra Bridger, the TIE Defender prototypes had been destroyed or stolen. Phoenix Squadron did a fantastic job at making Thrawn's life miserable. He, as a result, was forced to either comply to something as unnecessary as Stardust or challenge it. Thrawn, in wanting a stronger, more feasible empire, chose the latter. Stardust was beyond unhinged, and in the wrong hands it could do irreparable damage. Thrawn's choice for starting a warlord conflict came from Imperial preservation intentions. He feared what the Death Star could do to the Empire, and as a result, without Vader, the Inquisitors, or the Emperor, the Imperial machine caved in on itself. Luke and Vel, on Chandrila, spoke extensively about exiting this arranged marriage. It was entirely a political move made by Perrin to maintain Chandrilan stability in the aftermath of the incident with Mon. This arrangement absolutely did start prior to her Gorman-related speech, but it was solidified after her disappearance. While Lydia didn't live at home due to her own arranged marriage, she did visit with her brother because she knew how impacted by Mon's disappearance he would be. Skywalker knew where his mother was, but he still couldn't get to her, not yet at least, and that was hard for him to deal with. Even harder was the current situation with his wife, that he didn't know anything about. Their first argument was about breakfast pastries, and it all went downhill from there. She didn't share his enthusiasm for galactic humanitarian efforts, and thus, it frustrated him. It made Luke understand more of the dynamic between his mother and father. This specific arrangement put a lot of distance between father and son. Perrin knew it would happen, but he did it for the betterment of the family. One night, after the entire marriage was complete, Luke, with Vel's help, would abandon Chandrila and begin his trek towards Yavin, though due to the raging Imperial Civil War, he'd be redirected right into the hands of Mara Jade. She was using a pirate cruiser to escape the core. He was using a supply vessel to do the same thing. They met at Bodajef, outside the Mandalorian system, and the rest would be history, literally. Luke didn't harbor vengeful thoughts because she hadn't taken anything from him. Mara wasn't angry with Luke because her loss, to him, freed her from the inescapable reality of her captivity under Sidious's instruction. Mara was far from ever becoming a like-minded rebel, but now on their own great adventure, as young adults, they could try and provoke the other to join their side of thinking. Eventually, Luke's morally righteous and humanitarian qualities would overpower the brooding darkness that Palpatine instilled. Skywalker and Vel would meet again not far from Lothal, where she would introduce them to Gold Squadron, who was moving a rebel cell into Ezra's home world with the absence of Thrawn. They wouldn't see the Empire again, and a very small force under Governor Pryce's control would have an insane fight on their hands. Between Bridger, Jarrus, Jade, and Skywalker, the stormtroopers on Lothal were outmatched. Not to mention the rest of Gold Squadron and the madman, war criminal himself, Chopper. Governor Pryce and her Imperial holdout would crumble, This would be a mirrored event across the galaxy. The Warlord conflict divided the Empire so much that before Stardust could reach completion or the rebels could truly begin their sieges or battles against the Empire, the machine came to a complete halt. The churning power that was the Imperial regime stopped, and with it, the rebels were able to seize opportunities across the galaxy. It didn't really matter because without Palpatine, and thanks to the Warlord conflict, Imperial morale was so low that anyone could rise, and most people would follow them optimistically. The Alliance didn't need to run combative exercises against the regime. They just continued to build and rally support so that when the new government came into power, they could try and do away with the propaganda that fueled nearly 2 decades of Imperial rule. Before the Warlord conflict came to an end, Luke would reunite with his mom and Vel on Yavin. It would be here where Bail finally felt it was safe enough to tell Luke about his sister. He would meet Leia, as well as Ben Kenobi, who despite aging significantly, still had streaks of brown in his hair. Staying away from the sons of Tatooine really saved the age he looked. The rebellion was a fully fledged force, one that had been building since the first establishment of the Path, and before the Death Star was ever created. And before the Alliance ever targeted a single system, the war was over. Stardust ironically wouldn't be destroyed in the Warlord conflict, but some of the big-named Imperial officers would be, including the 2 main officers, Thrawn and Tarkin. Thanks to some work done by Captain Andor, the rebels would be able to find and capture Stardust, which had been abandoned. Instead of using a death beam, they would fill the dish with materials the Empire had, and thus the Death Star would be named the Liberator. It would take almost a couple years to get it fully functioning, but it would become the first intergalactic traveling community. It was large enough to fill millions of people comfortably, and it was encouraged. The Liberator was its own little ecosystem, and also just because the dish with the death beam wasn't attached, it didn't mean that it wasn't outfitted for defense, so no pirates would dare make a move on it. Politically and societally, the Senate refurbished itself as the New Republic, and Mothma was proposed for the elected position of Chancellor by Bail Organa. This would give Alderaan and Chandrila important seats in the new era. Luke and his younger sister Lydia would serve on the Chandrilan representative branch. Skywalker would also formally request a divorce before turning 18, something that would eventually free him from his arranged marriage. He and Perrin would have a couple years of the silent treatment before making amends and bridging the gap made in their family unit. Leia Organa would serve opposite her biological brother as the Senator of Alderaan, with Bail becoming an important piece of Mothma's cabinet. Thanks to conflict not being the total route of rebel victory, less people were inclined to continue chasing the Empire or the dream of it. The system failed the people, and its military overpowered itself. What remained of Palpatine's lifeline were loyalists with aspirations for a true remnant, but they'd be stomped out. Because every rebel of the former Alliance was a volunteer, the New Republic didn't have a military to send after the hidden remnant. But there was a cure. Following Yoda's natural passing, surrounded by Obi-Wan and Quinlan, the Boken Jedi Order would become a part of a New Republic task force called the Mercenaries. These were unpaid New Republic loyalists, like Guerrera, Luthen, Andor, the rest of Rogue One, and the Boken Jedi, who hunted down and destroyed Imperial remnant outposts. It was a means to have a defense force against the threat of an Imperial resurgence, without the budget of the former Imperial military. The Senate could not and would not rally around a military budget, and Mon was forced to work with what she could. Thankfully, Saw Gerrera was willing to use his troops and his life to take down the Imperials, because the New Republic needed to succeed. If Gerrera had been killed prior to this, the mercenary group likely would have never risen. The political career for Mon's children was bountiful. Lydia found a lot of enjoyment and eventually became leader of Chandrila's planetary government. Luke continued to chase the seat of Chancellor, but would never get it, eventually losing out a race to his biological sister following Mon Mothma's final term. Luke was cool with it though. He had the perfect life. He was a practicing Boken Jedi, one of the most successful senators in Chandrilan history, married to the woman he actually loved, and enjoyed a strong family life. Mon and Perrin would always have their own odds with each other, but it was worth the sacrifice in Mon's heart to give a better life to her children. Lydia would also follow in her brother's footsteps and eventually marry the person she actually loved. The Boken Jedi, once the war with the Remnant was over, retreated into uncharted territory at Pabu and built a new order. Though this became a hub, not a temple. People would come to and fro. Kanan, for example, had a life that he wished to live with Hera Syndulla, and he would live it. Luke would visit from time to time with Mara, and eventually their own kid. Ben Kenobi created an order that appeased survivors of the Purge, and welcomed in new faces readily and openly. As for other people from the mercenary group, they would either join the Republic military or retire, just like rebel volunteers. The Boken Jedi, like the New Republic, evolved to the changing times. They transformed their broken pasts into attainable futures, not for a select few, but for everyone around the galaxy. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash the like button. Let's talk about this story. So, a lot of elements here. This is actually like, I don't know, this might make my top 15, I'm not gonna lie. This was a really fun story. I think Mon Mothma would honestly kind of be the perfect parent for Luke. I don't know why, something about that dynamic would work. I think she'd push Luke to succeed at the best of his abilities. I think that dynamic would work really well. I really thought it would be fun to have Luke train in his own way, but not a part of the Jedi Order, not a part of Ben's order, but like train with a select few Jedi from that order. I think Luke would definitely go down a more political route, but I find it that Luke would succeed a lot more with the Force because of growing up around a sibling. I think growing up around a sibling and on a more peaceful world like Chandrila, I think he'd be gifted the ability to experiment with the Force a lot more. And that's what you see here with Lydia. He and Lydia get to be kids, and they're being kids and having fun. That's what they're doing. For Luke, when he becomes an adult, I thought it'd be fun to actually remove Vader from the equation entirely, like really early on. As for like Luke and Leia, I felt like Bail would not really encourage them to be open about their relationship as siblings. So I really wanted that to be the restrictive side of the story, whereas Mon almost seems more like a free kind of parent, which is ironic, but I feel like she would encourage Luke to know the truth more than Bail would. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the story. It's pretty wholesome. I'd call it a wholesome PP story. I don't know about you, but I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.